America, 1607 to 1776. In 1607, a group of merchant ships, licensed by the King of England, landed in the New World and established Jamestown, Virginia. Since this first colony, Americans have had an independent, self-reliant spirit. These colonists acknowledged the king, but recognized they could not depend on help or support from a nation thousands of miles across the sea. They were here on behalf of the Virginia Company, seeking fortunes and glory for themselves. Their priority was a commercial venture, not the conquest of a nation. Later in that century, another group of colonists arrived in Massachusetts. This group was not seeking commercial gain, but was escaping from religious persecution. These Puritan pilgrims were also aware that the king licensed the privately owned ships they sailed on, but to a large extent it was the crown itself they were fleeing. There was little loyalty to the king or trust of the Church of England by these pilgrims because of their Protestant beliefs that rejected the political entanglements of both. To the pilgrims, the collusion and corruption of the church was an affront to God, who sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to be their true king and savior. As time went on, the new colonies grew. The British Empire more or less acquired the colonies without having to conquer them. Nearly all of the commercial ventures failed, but the colonists were still predominantly Englishmen, so the crown simply absorbed the colonies into the British Empire without having to fight other nations for territory or control. In fact, in the early years, no English armies were present, so the small communities organized their own military forces to protect themselves. It was the local militias that handled military entanglements with the native populations or other marauding groups. Political bodies were also needed to help the communities deal with legal and commercial issues, but the king and parliament did not necessarily sanction these locally organized institutions. In most instances, the crown ignored them. Even the Church of England was not the dominant religious institution in America. Congregationalists, Quakers, Methodists, Calvinists, Baptists, and other denominations were thriving in certain regions, reducing the relevance of the traditional church. Early American society dealt with their problems and desires in their own ways, while the crown pretty much ignored the colonies. Eventually, authorities representing the crown were sent to the New World, where they found the culture rough and uncivilized. Most royal governors that were appointed by the king were more interested in returning to England than staying in America to govern. Although Americans considered themselves Englishmen, loyalty to the crown was negligible. Around 1700, British troops were stationed in the New World to fight against the French and Indians. Despite this need for protection, the cultural differences between the colonists and those who were sent to protect them became more pronounced. British soldiers thought the locals were incompetent, undisciplined, and unreliable. The colonists found the British to be arrogant, condescending, and exceedingly inflexible, particularly when fighting in the American wilderness. Neither liked or respected the other, even though they were all fighting for king and country. These experiences accumulated for more than a century, keeping the British Crown and the American colonies separated culturally as well as geographically. In the early 1700s, the king and parliament began to view the colonies as a new source of revenue. Taxes and tariffs had always been levied on imports and exports, but not on commerce within the colonies. Suddenly, small taxes, duties, and tariffs began to be imposed on the colonies. The colonists reacted strongly, rebelling against each new tax or duty with protests and embargoes. The king and parliament would then repeal the objectionable tax, but would soon replace it with another. The local governing bodies pleaded for the ability to participate in decisions about taxing their colonies, but this was met with contempt. In many cases, the local governors, appointed by the king, reacted by dissolving the local legislatures, further alienating the colonies. No taxation without representation became the call throughout the colonies, and this escalated into protests that inevitably escalated into violence. Many colonial leaders were beginning to demand representation, citing their rights as free Englishmen. But the king and parliament would not yield and resisted any encroachment on their authority. During this same time, many European philosophers and American theologians were challenging the age-old institutions of government and religion that kept kings and their cronies in power, no matter how corrupt and destructive they became. These new philosophies were described as the Enlightenment, and presented a dramatic new perspective about the dignity of mankind and his potential to flourish as a free person, not as a subject. Traveling ministers also preached new theologies and spread new religious ideas throughout America. Their sermons challenged the role of the church that was connected to the crown, while emphasizing the Protestant doctrine of Jesus Christ as a personal Savior. As a result, the validity of a state-supported church to gain God's grace was questioned. This period of Christian revival was labeled the Great Awakening. By 1765, the influences of unjust taxation, philosophical enlightenment, and religious revival converged with the cultural characteristics of rugged individualism and self-sufficiency, accelerating the deteriorating relationship between the colonies and the crown. In March of 1770, British troops killed several protesters in Boston, and this came to be known as the Boston Massacre. The colonists were outraged, and more protests ensued. The crown responded with more troops and more taxes. 3 years later, the Boston Tea Party occurred, further angering the crown. The king responded by closing Boston Harbor, which required the stationing of even more ships and troops in Massachusetts. As anger and distrust grew, British troops were sent to Lexington and Concord, just outside of Boston, to confiscate the gunpowder and arms stockpiled by the local militia. Paul Revere warned these communities that the Redcoats are coming, and when the Minutemen went to protect their armories, the British soldiers fired on and killed several of these colonists. This aggressive act galvanized all of the colonies to fight back against King George, and a few months later, colonial troops gathered on a hill overlooking Boston Harbor, attempting to drive the British out. But they were defeated at the Battle of Bunker Hill and retreated. It was becoming clear that tensions were escalating, so representatives from each colony secretly met in Philadelphia to decide what to do. With few victories and several significant defeats, the Continental Congress pinned their hopes on George Washington as commander of the Continental Army. The 13 colonies were now officially at war with England, and the two sides were fighting each other on several fronts throughout the colonies. Despite this, the Continental Congress spent over a year debating and arguing, trying to decide if the colonies were going to continue attempts to compromise with the king or declare independence, establishing a separate nation. Finally, on July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted and sent to the king. Copies of the document were read or distributed to the people of what was now the 13 United States of America. We were formally separated from England and the king. Our purpose was clear, but our destiny was not. The process of becoming a separate nation took more than 30 years, and during most of this time, the idea of becoming an independent country was not a consideration. However, the document that is the Declaration of Independence has become the quintessential pronouncement that establishes the principles and ideals of the United States. Who we are, why we exist, what we stand for, how we are governed, and the entire structure of our American society are eloquently stated in the few paragraphs of the Declaration. Most Americans have read or been exposed to the Declaration of Independence and know of its importance. But the meaning of America's founding document has faded over time. We are all living the legacy articulated in the Declaration, so all of us should have at least a basic understanding of what it says and why its timeless principles are still relevant today.
The Declaration of Independence. In Congress, July 4th, 1776. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. Not only is the Declaration the foundation stone of our country, it is one of the most significant documents in the history of all mankind. The Declaration of Independence was originally written on one sheet of parchment and was signed by delegates from each of the 13 colonies. It is not a long document, but it is easier to understand if the elements are broken down into 5 parts: the premise, the principles, the grievances, the declaration, and the pledge. The parts of the Declaration that are the most familiar and have had the most influence on the trajectory of human civilization are the principles and the pledge. Please follow along as we examine these portions of the American birth certificate. The principles. We hold these truths to be self-evident. This may sound like an obvious statement, but in 1776, truth would not be considered to be self-evident. No, truth would be determined and defined by the Crown, in this case, King George III, the Church of England, and the British Parliament. This is a not-so-subtle affront to the crown because it threatens the existing power structure of the rulers over subject. The four self-evident truths that the Declaration presents are: all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. Truth 1. All men are created equal. In today's world, it is hard to comprehend the radical nature of this statement. Throughout history, societies were segregated into rulers over subjects, and classes were determined by birth rather than merit. Social and economic mobility were unheard of, so inequality was the norm. To the founders, this statement had theological underpinnings. Every individual is an image bearer of God, and as such, equality comes from the Creator, not men. So the recipient is accountable to the Creator, not a man. Truth 2. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable or inherent rights. In other words, a person's rights come from the Creator, God, instead of privileges that could be granted or taken away by the crown or other worldly authorities. Truth 1 and 2 radically shift power away from the crown and to the Creator. Truth 3. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These listed rights are multifaceted. For instance, life means living and breathing, but it also includes civil rights, such as free speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom to protect yourself, your family, and your property. Each individual has God-given rights to live without oppression from others, including tyrannical governments. Liberty is another multifaceted word and is not synonymous with the word freedom. Freedom is an outward expression and needs to be restrained, or else it is destructive to the individual or to the society. In a ruler-subject society, personal freedom is restrained by force or fear. On the other hand, liberty is a person's free will, which is a biblical concept that allows each person the choice to restrain their individual freedom by directing their choices towards virtue, and virtue was defined in this era by a biblical worldview. The founders understood that self-government requires self-control. Finally, the pursuit of happiness was originally written the pursuit of property, a phrase that was understood to be a person's right to own, use, and control their property. However, the New England delegations objected to this language because it could suggest that slavery, a person owning another person, was endorsed in the Declaration. After much debate, the word was changed to happiness, which should be understood as an economic term, meaning a person's creativity, ambition, economic self-sufficiency, personal prosperity, and the entrepreneurial spirit. Also note the word pursuit, which implies an action is required to achieve happiness. We are not endowed with happiness or property, we are given the opportunity to pursue it. This reinforces the idea that rights are not passive, they require action. The pursuit of happiness represents the blueprint for all to flourish. Before going to truth number 4, it is helpful to review the preceding principles to see how revolutionary these ideas were and still are today. It's quite clear that the Declaration was not only declaring independence from the crown, it is proclaiming dependence on the Creator, the God of the Bible. In other sections of the document, it refers to the laws of nature and of nature's God, the supreme judge of the world, divine providence, and other phrases that have theological underpinnings. The replacement of the crown with the Creator is presented as a theological and philosophical idea instead of a political or ideological argument, putting forth a new framework for organizing society. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This truth is the manifestation of the 3 preceding truths. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This principle turns the traditional relationship between citizens and government upside down. It requires government to secure and protect the rights of the individual, not distribute privileges from on high. Power now resides in the people, and they select representatives to fulfill this principle. This is the essence of what government is supposed to be, but has never been before. Articulating these principles in such a concise and almost poetic way is in and of itself a literary masterpiece. But to see these ideas become realities is hard to imagine, let alone achieve. Yet the founders went on to create systems that ordered the principles into a self-governed constitutional republic, a spectacular free market economy, and a culture oriented toward liberty and virtue, transforming society into a new form of civilization. Following the Four Truths is a section listing 27 grievances that describe the causes for separation imposed on the colonies by the Crown. It is an extensive list, with some of the grievances transferred to the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It is stunning to read through the grievances and see how they can still apply to authoritarian governments in today's world. After the grievances, the Declaration consists of a few paragraphs that make it abundantly clear that the United States of America will no longer be a colony of Great Britain. It fervently declares war and makes it clear that there is no longer a pathway to reconciliation. The United States of America will become a new and unique nation in the annals of history. The last sentence is the pledge. And for support of this declaration, and with firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Signed by 56 representatives of the 13 United States of America. When they made this pledge, they were serious about it. Pledging their lives for the cause of liberty became a reality. Even as the ink was drying on the parchment, they instantly became fugitives, running and hiding from the British for years to come. Many had family and friends killed, kidnapped, and tortured. A sizable number died during the war or from injuries or sickness caused by battle. Some, like Ben Franklin, had family members that remained loyal to the Crown. His son was a loyalist, and he never spoke to his father again. When they pledged their fortunes, it was serious. During the war, the economy crumbled since the currency of the Crown was no longer supporting the rebellion. Banking, investing, and financial planning came to a halt. Operating a business was impossible because of the political upheaval. In essence, any fortunes the founders had were confiscated, leaving much of the nation destitute. It seems miraculous that all 56 of the signers unanimously pledged our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor as their support of the Declaration. As described, most of them lost everything they had, died young, and were forgotten. But not one violated their sacred honor and their resolve to support independence. This dedication left subsequent generations a nation built upon liberty, prosperity, and unbounded opportunity. Yet they understood the fragility of this legacy and frequently prayed for its survival. It is now this generation's solemn duty to honor and perpetuate this God-given gift to mankind.